If we gather together, it's my great pleasure to introduce our fourth and final keynote of the conference today, Professor Paul Gavrilyuk. Paul was born in Kiev and for 5 years in 1988 first studied physics at the Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology. He was one of the first scholars from the former Soviet Union to come to the United States to pursue graduate work in theology. In 2001, he received his doctorate in patristics from Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, and he is currently the distinguished holder of the Aquinas Chair in Theology at the University of St. Thomas at St. Paul's. His numerous books have demonstrated a breadth of theological mastery, as well as high command of the complex and intimate details of numerous areas of work, stretching from antiquity to postmodernity. His early work on the catechumenate of the ancient church has been reissued in multiple languages today. His 2004 Oxford monograph on St. Cyril of Alexandria, The Suffering of the Impassible God, was a seminal study that forced his generation of systematic theologians to pay attention to the primary sources instead of dismissing the ancients with textbook cliches. His fascinating 2008 study, Immersed in the Life of God, considers the healing resources of the Christian tradition. Paul works as a leading international expert across the disparate fields of Christian philosophy, liturgics, systematic thought, and history. In recent years, he has closely followed the careers and the controversies surrounding Father George Florovsky, who was, for a short period, a professor at Union Seminary here. Not only following Father George, but his circle of correspondence. This work was brilliantly presented in his Oxford monograph of 2014, George Florovsky and the Russian Religious Renaissance. Within that dialectic, the reception of the thought of Dionysius the Areopagite played a significant role with Florovsky and the Russian émigré, which will be tonight's topic for our final keynote. Please warmly welcome Professor Paul Gavrilyuk.
Thank you so much, John. You spoke today so eloquently about the gift of tears. As many of us would know, those of us especially who read student papers and examinations during this time of the year are given this gift of tears naturally or supernaturally. And if the gift of tears is a sign of genuine piety, what do you do with the man to whom his doctor prescribes artificial tears so that he could just speak? I want to take this moment also to celebrate the legacy of the Sophia Institute and its director. I think we're celebrating this year, we're celebrating, as we've heard, the decennalia, the 10th anniversary of the Institute, and we're also celebrating your John Vicenalia, which means or rather a 20th anniversary of Professor McGuckin's teaching at Union Theological Seminary. And what an extraordinary legacy worthy of his predecessors this was. What was mentioned today is the fact that this is the 9th conference of the Sophia Institute, corresponding fittingly to the 9 ranks of angels in the Dionysian hierarchy. We're also told that the Institute itself produced 12 important studies, partially based on the conferences themselves. But I think also that your impact and your legacy are not merely measured by conferences and books. They're measured by the inspiration that you give to your students, your parishioners, and indeed to scholars around the world. And I think it's that legacy that I personally would pray and hope that will continue at this institution in the future, God willing. At this point, I've been asked to make a commercial break and mention the International Orthodox Theological Association that Professor McGuckin has already mentioned. And the idea essentially is that it would be a forum for intelligentsia to reconstitute the kind of republic of letters that you find in action in this very gathering, also on the international level. And so our first conference is going to be in Iași, Romania, and it is especially wonderful to see amongst the participants and presenters today so many of our colleagues of Romanian origin. And so the conference itself will be on January 9th through 12th of 2019, and the call for papers will be issued sometime this summer. And so IOTA already has a developing website, and we will go public in the near future. All will leave in the yellowish sheet that I think many of you picked up. You will also see the leadership of the organization. But principally, it's a forum for an international, interdisciplinary scholarly exchange, and it will be only as good as what you here present shape it to be. As we've already learned from Professor Blowers today, the mode of theologizing associated with the 6th century author, Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite, has made an indelible mark upon the development of Byzantine Orthodox tradition and the overall tenor of Orthodox theology. Although much in Dionysian writings could justifiably provoke controversy, their incorporation into the Orthodox tradition was surprisingly quick and met with relatively little resistance. Commenting on this peculiar development, late Yaroslav Pelikan wrote, "There is both historical significance," and I should say that there is a souvenir de visite in the form of a handout, and so that first quote is also in the handout. "There is both historical significance," says Pelikan, "and theological irony in the chronological coincidence between the condemnation of Origen and the rise of Dionysian mysticism. For most of the doctrines on account of which the Second Council of Constantinople anathematized Origen were far less dangerous to the tradition of Catholic Orthodoxy. That was the crypto-Origenism canonized in the works of Dionysius the Areopagite," says Pelikan. Now, there is much truth in Professor Pelikan's provocative comment, and that is Dionysius is, in some ways, more dangerous to the tradition of Catholic Orthodoxy than Origen. Origen's boldest speculations pale in comparison before the linguistic and mystical audacity of the Areopagite. Dionysius continued Origen's baptism of later Platonism by principally freely plagiarizing Proclus. Whether Dionysius qualifies as a closet Origenist, of course, is going to remain a subject of controversy. The rediscovery of Dionysius by the 20th century Orthodox thinkers is a largely untold story, which deserves a book-length exposition. And if there are any capable doctoral students in this audience who would like to undertake that exposition, I think that certainly could be arranged. Here, I will be able to sketch only the main contours of this story. I will argue that modern Orthodox interpreters of Dionysius located his work within their distinct master narratives, treating Dionysian theology as a foundation, as a problem, and as a polemical weapon. The master narratives that I will discuss have shaped the 20th century Orthodox theology as it came to differentiate itself from Western Christian thought. Hence, the title of Vladimir Lossky's book that forms, of course, an allusion to which is the very title of our conference, The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church. My survey will proceed in chronological order. I'll begin by considering Sergei Bulgakov's treatment of Dionysian epiphatic theology and its uneasy relationship with his sophiology. Bulgakov was banished from the Soviet Union in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, and for the last 2 decades of his life, in 30s and 40s, taught at the newly founded Orthodox Theological Institute at Saint-Serge in Paris. Next, I will consider 2 émigré figures who had little affinity with Bulgakov's sophiology, namely Nikolai Berdyaev and his younger contemporary, Vladimir Lossky. Lossky's approach to Dionysian epiphaticism had considerable influence on Orthodox theology, including the work of the Greek theologian Christos Yannaras. After Yannaras, I will then consider John Meyendorff, who in the 1950s left France and crossed the Atlantic to teach at St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary, which then was still located in this fair seminary. We will see that, in contrast to Lossky, Meyendorff was quite critical of certain aspects of Dionysian theology, a criticism that provoked further discussion involving such scholars as Paul Vesey, Eric Pearl, and Bishop Alexander Golitsyn. When we examine these different engagements of Dionysius closely, we realize that Lossky's adoption of Dionysian mystical theology as a standard has had both devoted followers and passionate detractors. In fact, the precise place of Dionysians in the history of Orthodox theology remains to be clarified and reevaluated. Such a reevaluation will tell us as much about Dionysian theological vision as about the theological priorities of our predecessors. This lecture, then, is an invitation to see 20th century Orthodox theology through the luminous darkness of Dionysius. Bulgakov's theological career had an important epiphatic moment associated with his first major theological treatise, The Unfading Light, published in Russia in 1917. In The Unfading Light, Bulgakov makes his foray into religious epistemology, cosmology, and anthropology, under the influence of Vladimir Solovyov and Pavel Florensky. The Unfading Light is divided into three main sections, the first dedicated to the doctrine of God, then creation, and then the third to theological anthropology. The first section is provocatively entitled Divine Nothing, or Non-Being, an expression that is broadly Neoplatonic and Dionysian in inspiration. According to Dionysius, since God doesn't belong to the order of created beings, all creaturely properties must be denied of God, including existence. Following Plotinus, Dionysius concludes mystical theology by observing that God, I quote, falls neither within the predicate of non-being nor of being, end of quotation. Echoing Dionysius, Bulgakov declares, religious philosophy knows no more central problem than the meaning of divine non-being. In a lengthy chapter of about 40 pages, Bulgakov provides the first sketch of the history of negative theology in Russian philosophy. He discusses Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, Philo, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, the Cappadocian Fathers, and reaches Dionysius, whom he calls, I quote, the true father of epiphatic theology, unquote. According to Bulgakov, the central point of the divine names lies in upholding the transcendence, inexpressibility, and incomprehensibility of God. Bulgakov observes that Dionysius offers a form of epiphaticism that is more radical than that of Plotinus. For Dionysius, God surpasses even the notion of oneness. After Dionysius, Bulgakov turns to Maximus the Confessor, John of Damascus, Gregory Palamas, Eurygena, Nicholas of Cusa, as well as Jewish, German, and English mystics. Bulgakov closes his overview of the history of negative theology, quite surprisingly, with Immanuel Kant. Bulgakov sees an unrealized potential for negative theology in Kant's notion of Ding an sich, to which no human categories apply and which remains outside of the boundaries of human experience. Kant himself, Bulgakov is quick to point out, was no mystic, but rather a narrow rationalist, as attested by his Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, a book that Bulgakov calls religiously tasteless. I think most of us would agree. Thus, Bulgakov locates Dionysius in the master narrative which begins with Plato and continues through select church fathers, philosophers, and mystics, and some heretics, and ends with Immanuel Kant. In The Unfading Light, Bulgakov reads Dionysius as a historian of Platonism would, not as a church historian. And unlike other Orthodox theologians in our story, Bulgakov is not concerned at all with how Dionysian theology fits within the patristic tradition and with Byzantine Orthodoxy. The approach of Bulgakov's friend and critic, Nikolai Berdyaev, presents several intriguing points of comparison. In Spirit and Reality, the foundations of divine human spirituality, Berdyaev inserts Dionysius into a master narrative similar to Bulgakov's, dedicating even more attention to the German mystics, especially Meister Eckhart and his beloved Jacob Boehme. Following the dominant view of the Western scholarship of his time, Berdyaev dismissively treats Dionysius as, I quote, mainly a repetition of Plotinus and Neoplatonism. In his earlier work, Freedom in the Spirit, Berdyaev criticizes the Church Fathers for sidelining mystical writers. Berdyaev observes that school theology, or we could, I suppose, translate it as official theology, has a tendency towards either ostracizing or domesticating mysticism. For Berdyaev, the true purpose of the dogmas is to express the mystical experience of the Church, not to stifle mystical life. He recognizes the possibility of the approved Orthodox mysticism, such as that of Dionysius, a Simeon the New Theologian, but insists that the church authorities have often been afraid of the mystics and distrusted them. And again, what we've heard today about Saint Simeon seems to confirm this troubled narrative. In contrast to Berdyaev, Bulgakov doesn't emphasize a tension between the official teaching of the church and the work of the mystics. So now, again, back to Bulgakov's material. Although epiphaticism plays a constructive role in Bulgakov's unfading light, the situation changes as Bulgakov's theological thought matured. In his great trilogy on godmanhood, comprising the Lamb of God, the Comforter, and the Bride of the Lamb, the distinctive epistemic concerns of epiphatic theology have receded into the background. For example, in The Bride of the Lamb, which covers many of the same subjects as The Unfading Light, written a quarter-century earlier, Bulgakov no longer engaged Dionysius or broader epiphatic tradition in any depth. Bulgakov eternalizes the content of Revelation, folding the events of salvation history into the inner life of the Trinity, with the result that the distinction between the divine economy and the immanent Trinity all but disappears. Vladimir Lossky correctly criticizes Bulgakov's sophiological speculations for lacking the epiphatic reserve. Indeed, sometimes one gets a feeling that Bulgakov knows about the inner life of the Trinity more than the persons of the Trinity know about themselves. While Russian sophiology follows the trajectory of Christian Platonism, its mystical underpinnings are quite different from those of Dionysian theology. For Dionysius, the paradigm is provided by the ecstatic, ineffable union with God, completely imageless and surpassing all powers of perception and intellect. In contrast, in Russian sophiology, the experiential paradigm is set by the manifestation of Sophia, the wisdom of God. Perhaps the contrast between the apophatic and Sophianic mystical theology should not be drawn too sharply, since one aspect of sophiology is the awareness of the eternal beauty of God in creation, that has some parallels with Dionysian vision of the cosmos as a complex hierarchy of symbols bespeaking the beauty of God. Nevertheless, the Dionysian version of Platonism sharply differs from that of Russian sophiologists in another respect. Sophiology's primary reference point is Chalcedonian Christology. Sophiology baptizes Platonism and Platonizes revelation by transforming the divine incarnation into a general metaphysical principle of godmanhood, the principle by means of which the material cosmos and humanity acquire their ontological link, eternal ground, and transformative potential in God. In contrast, Dionysian cosmology does not account for the centrality of the divine incarnation in a comparably strong way. Russian sophiology is a version of Christian panentheism, which fails to do justice to the apophatic dimension. In contrast, Dionysian Platonism is a form of Christian epiphaticism that, according to some of its critics, tends to obfuscate the importance of the incarnation. Where Dionysius speaks epiphatically about the things revealed, the Russian sophiologists speak cataphatically about the things hidden. Moving now to Vladimir Lossky. One of Bulgakov's most unwavering critics was his younger contemporary, Vladimir Lossky. When the controversial elements of Bulgakov's Sophiology came to the attention of the Russian Orthodox ecclesiastical authorities, it was Lossky who compiled a comprehensive report on the basis of which the head of the Russian Church, Metropolitan Sergei Strogorodsky, and the Synod of the Patriarchate of Moscow issued their condemnations of Bulgakov's system. In attacking Sophiology, Lossky used the thought of the Church Fathers, especially that of Dionysius, as a polemical weapon. Together with George Florovsky, Lossky was at the forefront of a return to the Fathers in Eastern Orthodox theology, a movement that was coterminous with the development, with similar conversations that were taking place in Roman Catholic ressourcement movement in the Francophone sections of Europe. If one were to name one patristic author who influenced Lossky's theological vision most, it would be Dionysius. Lossky began his scholarly career by publishing an article on the epiphatism of the Areopagite. The study of various forms of via negativa and related epistemological issues remained of focal concern to him throughout his life and are especially prominent in the mystical theology of the Eastern Church, 1944. A book that is evoked in the very title of this conference. I should mention that when I mentioned the title of the conference to my taxi driver as I was driving to the airport, he said, "Oh yes, that's the stuff that I'm really interested in. Are you going to be talking about I Ching and Yin and Yang and other things?" And I decided that I'm not going to correct him on that front. But I think this only indicates the importance of conferences such as this, so that we, if you will, raise awareness of the existence of the Eastern Christian tradition. And so in an earlier article, Lossky distinguishes between epiphaticism as a speculative method and as a religious attitude towards the incomprehensibility of God. Lossky criticizes the Thomistic tradition for its tendency to downplay the role of via negativa and to subordinate it to via positiva. For Aquinas, as Lossky interprets him, the method of negation amounts to a qualification that no positive predicates apply to God in an infinite creaturely sense. In a finite creaturely sense. But the predicates can be applied to God analogically, understood in a more elevated sense befitting God, according to Aquinas. Lossky contends that the Thomistic form of epiphaticism fails to account for Dionysius' insistence that ultimately all talk about God must be abandoned in the unity of experience beyond all words and beyond knowledge. For Lossky, epiphaticism is, and I quote, above all, an attitude of mind which refuses to form concepts about God, unquote. Elsewhere, Lossky also criticizes Aquinas' doctrine of analogy on exegetical grounds, arguing that the Latin translation of Dionysius' writing that Aquinas had at his disposal didn't do justice to the conceptual richness of the Greek term analogia. According to Lossky, analogia refers primarily to the creaturely capacity or aptitude to participate in God, not to the theory of predication. Lossky's understanding of epiphaticism has had considerable influence upon many 20th century Orthodox thinkers, including Greek Orthodox theologian Christos Yannaras. In the introduction to his book on the absence and unknowability of God, Heidegger and the Areopagite, Yannaras observes that the main purpose of his study is, and I quote, to clarify the difference between Greek thought and the West, unquote. If Lossky allows for different kinds of epiphaticism in the West, Yannaras mistakenly but confidently reduces all forms of Western epiphaticism to the method of correcting the limits of analogical predication in natural theology. Like Lossky, he contrasts this view with Dionysian epiphaticism properly understood, which points to the experiential immediacy and relatedness of God. According to Yannaras, the knowledge acquired in the ineffable personal encounter with God surpasses propositional knowledge. Whether the emphasis upon the non-propositional personal knowledge of this sort can be credibly derived from Dionysian corpus is a rather dubious point, although both Yannaras and Lossky are convinced that in fact it could be. Yannaras goes so far as to make a distinction between the Greek epiphaticism of person and the Western epiphaticism of essence. This historically unsupportable distinction is at odds with Gregory Palamas's distinction between the unknowable essence of God and the experientially accessible divine energies. Lossky and Yannaras' distinction is surprisingly close, actually, to Bertrand Russell's distinction between knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description, or the philosophical ideas associated with Martin Buber's I and thou, and similar motifs in French existentialism. As Rowan Williams points out, and I quote, Lossky is able to develop his emphasis on personal encounter in the knowledge of God in a way which at times seems consciously and deliberately to echo philosophers like Sartre. End of quotation. In other words, Lossky and Yannaras often fought the misguided West with the ammunition borrowed from the enemy. Having described Dionysian epiphaticism as the abandonment of every conceptual necessity and annihilation of all conceptual idols of God, Yannaras transfers this concept into the context of contemporary European nihilism and agnosticism. Yannaras argues that the Enlightenment critique of Christianity applies to the conceptual idol of God or to the God of Western European natural theology. When Nietzsche's Superman proclaimed the death of God, it was the God of Western rationalism and scholasticism that became defunct. The God of Dionysian epiphaticism cannot be conceptually attacked because this deity cannot be conceptually expressed. It is impossible to prove or disprove the existence of a God who surpasses existence, as well as other categories of human thought. Yannaras agrees with Heidegger's critique of ontotheology, but criticizes Heidegger for failing to see the connection between his philosophy of being and Dionysius's ontology. Although Yannaras' position has been rightly criticized for being dangerously close to agnosticism, the parallels that he sees between Dionysius and Heidegger are certainly not without foundation. Like Lossky, Yannaras believes that Eastern Orthodox theology, when purified of its Western influences, can withstand the intellectual onslaughts of postmodernity. So let me return to Lossky. Lossky makes Dionysius the centerpiece of the master narrative leading from early fathers to the 14th-century Byzantine theologians, from Clement of Alexandria to Gregory Palamas. In his lectures read at Sorbonne in 1945-1946, and subsequently translated into English and published posthumously under the title The Vision of God, Lossky likewise accords central place to Dionysius. Lossky sees in Dionysian mystical theology the epitome of all previous patristic discussions of the possibility of direct, unmediated experience of God. He evaluates Clement, Origen, and Eunomius against the norms of Dionysian mystical theology. Clement's account of the vision of God is deemed intellectualist, on the grounds that such experience allegedly involves exclusively intellectual faculties, exalts the knowledge of God above salvation, and is not as strongly epiphatic as that of Dionysius. Origen is similarly accused of intellectualism for construing divine incomprehensibility as a function of creaturely limitations of rational beings. In Lossky's scheme, Eunomius gets the worst possible press, and he represents the intellectualism of the worst kind, since he taught that even the fallen human mind was able to comprehend the essence of God. The proponents of what Lossky calls subjective unknowability of God, and that is Clement, Origen, and Eunomius, are contrasted with the Cappadocian Fathers, Dionysius, and other patristic writers of unblemished orthodoxy, who are the advocates of objective unknowability of God, and that is the view that God's essence cannot be known in principle, even by the deified intellect. On Lossky's reading, Dionysian mystical theology was the dogmatic basis for a distinction already inherent in the thought of the Cappadocian Fathers and most fully developed by Gregory Palamas, and that is the distinction between the unknowable essence of God and the uncreated but cognitively accessible energies of God. Lossky's aim is to show the profound continuity between Dionysius and Palamas. For the purpose of this largely apologetic task, Lossky makes Dionysius appear more orthodox than he really was. So, for example, he insists that Dionysian epiphaticism does not eliminate the Trinitarian distinctions. In defense of this claim, Lossky points to Dionysian distinction between the unified names, which are, for example, such names as power and goodness, which apply to Godhead as a whole, and the differentiated names, and that is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which refer to the divine persons. Recent scholarship seems actually to support the main thrust of Lossky's interpretation, although I think the matter is likely to remain controversial because Dionysius' own account is unstable. Now, because of his training as a medievalist, Lossky knew that Dionysian mysticism had a complex history in Western thought, influencing such controversial figures as Meister Eckhart and John Scotus Eriugena. In fact, there is arguably a Lossky by day who writes his articles about Dionysius, and then there is a Lossky by night, the Lossky of 25 years, who writes an extraordinary monograph on Meister Eckhart, subsequently published by Etienne Gilson. But for Lossky, far from being controversial, Dionysian apophaticism was the very standard of orthodoxy. While dismissing Origenism as Platonic intellectualism and spiritualism alien to the spirit of the Gospels, that's a quote from Lossky, Lossky treats Dionysian Platonism as successfully Christianized. And so such an apportionment of blame upon the heretical Origen and praise upon the Orthodox Dionysius clashes with Yaroslav Pelikan's charge that Dionysius was a closet Origenist. More generally, Lossky's judgment is not likely to have much sympathy amongst the present-day patristic scholars. That is, the judgment that contrasts to such an extent Origen and Denis. The central claim of the mystical theology of the Eastern Church is the inseparability and harmony of theology and mysticism. And this is a similar quote that occurs later in the treatise. Doctrinal tradition, says Lossky, beacons set up by the Church along the channel of the knowledge of God, cannot be separated from or opposed to mystical tradition, acquired experience of the mysteries of the faith. Dogma cannot be understood apart from experience. The fullness of experience cannot be had apart from true doctrine. It is for this reason that in the present work we have sought to present the tradition of the Eastern Church as a mystical theology, doctrine and experience mutually conditioning each other. Now, Lossky acknowledges his self-imposed limitation. He's presenting Eastern Orthodox theology as mystical, not because of its complex history yields such an unclouded relationship between theology and mysticism, but because of his operating assumption that all authentic theology is mystical and all genuine mystical experience confirms the dogmas of the Church. As Berdyaev already reminded us, historically the situation has been far more complex. Some mystics were persecuted, others were canonized. In some cases, like that of Simeon the New Theologian, a mystic was first persecuted and then canonized. Lossky was not as interested in getting the accurate historical picture as in presenting Orthodox theology as it ought to be. And it is in this highly idealized picture that struck a chord with many Western converts to Orthodoxy. So many educated Western believers have been inducted into Orthodox ethos through Lossky's mystical theology of the Eastern Church, that its audacity and originality of his approach, as well as the apologetic thrust of what he is doing, is often overlooked. But in fact, Lossky's claim that the whole tenor of Eastern dogmatic theology was mystical and Dionysian, this very claim was nothing less than the turning of the tables on his advisor at Sorbonne, Etienne Gilson, who as early as 1934 published Mystical Theology of Saint Bernard, La Théologie mystique de Saint Bernard de Clairvaux. So as Isabelle de Andia observes, and I quote, while it is commonplace that Dionysius had a greater influence upon the West than upon the East, that seemed to be a commonplace, Vladimir Lossky reverses this statement by making Dionysius the model of the mystical theology of the Eastern Church. No Orthodox theologian before Lossky, not even Maximus or Palamas, dared to arrange the patristic symphony around Dionysius as playing the first violin. I owe this to my brilliant graduate research assistant, you realize. While immensely influential, Lossky's fresh restatement of Orthodox theology was by no means shared by all of his contemporaries. So, for example, Alexander Schmemann, oh, there is another one. That's with Palamas as a conductor. So, for example, Alexander Schmemann could write the historical road of Eastern Orthodoxy without as much as mentioning Dionysius. No Dionysius at all, anywhere. The primary reason for this omission, I would argue, had to do with the fact that Schmemann's eschatological vision, with its emphasis on the manifestation of God's kingdom in liturgical time, was at odds with the vertical eschatology of Dionysian liturgical symbolism, in which liturgical time essentially played no role. Turning now to John Meyendorff. In his approach to neo-patristic theology, John Meyendorff follows the main contours of the same historical narrative leading from the early fathers to Gregory Palamas. In contrast to Lossky, however, Meyendorff moves from the focus of the Palamite master narrative from mystical theology to Christology. Now, Dionysian Christology, as it's generally admitted, leaves many questions unanswered. Hence, it's to be expected that in Meyendorff's version of Neopalamism, Dionysian theology loses its status of the dogmatic basis of Byzantine theology, and that's Lossky's characterization, to the theological synthesis of Maximus the Confessor. In his early work, Christ in Eastern Christian Thought, Meyendorff writes, if Dionysius was successful in the area of theologia, his success was much more questionable in the realms of cosmology and ecclesiology, in which the absence of common Christological references made illusory his effort to bridge completely the gap between the gospel and Neoplatonism. So Meyendorff recognizes that the struggle between the non-Christian and Christian intellectual currents in Hellenism was prolonged and at times acrimonious. He presents the Christianization of Platonism as a dynamic process. Origen's attempt to Christianize Platonism represents one of the earliest stages of this process. However, in Meyendorff's view, a historical theologian should not freeze Origen's alleged failures in time, but consider how Origenism was in turn reworked, partially rejected, and more fully Christianized by the later fathers, including Maximus. Unlike Lossky, Meyendorff does not present Origen as a failure and Dionysius as a success in the story of the gradual Christianization of Platonism. For Meyendorff, both of them were only partially successful and required correction by the later church fathers. In Meyendorff's view, Dionysian adoption of the hierarchical structure of the Neoplatonic universe is problematic because it obscured the centrality of God's direct and unmediated gift of salvation in the Incarnation. It also leads Dionysius to a hierarchy of the 9 angelic orders, which, as Meyendorff points out, has, I quote, no foundation in Scripture. Still, Meyendorff credits Dionysius with having initiated the process of baptizing the hierarchical conception of cosmos by making the hierarchy of being a feature of the created order, not an outcome of the noetic fall, as it was for Origen, for example. And in this respect, Dionysius moves one step beyond Origen in Christianizing Platonic cosmology. Meyendorff finds that Dionysius' theology needs further correction in the area of ecclesiology. Meyendorff claims that Dionysius' conception of celestial and ecclesiastical hierarchies is static and artificial. Dionysius' attempt to correlate the 3 stages of the spiritual progress, purification, illumination, and perfection, with his threefold ministerial orders of deacons, priests, and bishops, doesn't correspond well to their liturgical functions. And the most serious problem is that, and I quote, the relationship between God and man are conceived in a purely individualistic manner and are completely determined by the system of intermediaries. End of quotation from Meyendorff. More damaging even is Meyendorff's critique that Dionysius' liturgical theology reduces the material objects used in liturgical activity to the symbols of higher immaterial reality. According to Meyendorff, Dionysius' theology of the Eucharist, on which we've heard an eloquent exposition today from Professor Blowers, is insufficiently Christological and incarnational. According to Meyendorff, Dionysius' conception of the cosmos as a static hierarchy and his idea of how different ecclesiastical orders communicate divine illumination in the liturgy has led to various problems, including clericalism. Along similar lines, Paul Vesey argues that Dionysius failed to account for the soteriological significance of the transformation of the human body and material creation, and in the final analysis, quote, renders superfluous the incarnation of Christ. That's probably the harshest critique of Dionysius on the incarnation, comes from Vesey. Similarly negative conclusions have been a part of the Protestant and Roman Catholic readings of Dionysius for quite some time. And so Meyendorff's and Vesey's criticism provoked Eric Pearl and others to rise to Dionysius' defense and restore him to the diptychs. And so in response to that, Pearl maintains, and I quote, Dionysius represents precisely those doctrines which are most typical of orthodoxy in distinction from the West. Creation as theophany, grace as continuous with nature, knowledge as union of knower and known, incarnation and sacrament as fulfillment, not exception or addition, liturgy as the realization of the cosmos, mysticism as ontological union rather than psychological condition, sin as corruption and loss of being, not legalistic transgression, atonement as physical ontological assumption, not justification or juridical satisfaction, hierarchy as service and love, not oppression and envy. And so Pearl reads Dionysius through the lens of Lossky's mystical theology of the Eastern Church. And like Lossky, Pearl was aware of the fact that Dionysius' theology had a rich and complex history in Western theology too. While the Christian West could partially receive different Dionysian insights, including his epiphaticism, it was the Christian East that did justice to the totality of his theological vision. For Pearl, similar to Lossky, Dionysian theology serves as a marker of a distinctly Eastern Christian theological identity. To conclude, in the last century, the retrieval of Dionysian theology has been intertwined with the uneasy quest for Orthodoxy's 20th century identity. While both Lossky and Meyendorff agree that Dionysius is better understood when read through the eyes of Palamas, rather than through the eyes of Aquinas, they come to very different conclusions. For Lossky, Dionysius' mystical theology points to the experiential ground of all proper theological discourse. Dionysian mystical theology functions as a criterion of orthodoxy and as a dogmatic ground of Byzantine theology. In Lossky's judgment, where Origen failed to baptize Platonism, Dionysius has succeeded in articulating an apophatic vision based on revelation rather than philosophy. Along with the Cappadocian Fathers, Dionysius is also viewed as the mastermind of the foundational distinction between the unknowable essence and the knowable energies of God. Thus, in Lossky's version of neopatristics, the main signposts are Dionysius and Palamas. Well, there is also this. This is, and the baptismal image, I should say, of course, this is Maximian, and this is Meyendorff's reading of the matter. So John Meyendorff destabilizes this account by building the Palamide synthesis in a different way by taking Christology as his organizing theme. And as a result, Dionysius' role changes from that of the true father of mysticism, and that's Bulgakov, and dogmatic ground, and that's Lossky, to a sort of an enfant terrible requiring a Christological corrective, provided by Maximus the Confessor, Palamas, and others. So again, back to that sort of image of Palamas baptizing Plato through Dionysius. Russian Sophiology and Dionysian theology approach the baptism of Platonisms differently. Sophiology emphasizes the sacramentality of material creation and even postulates the transfigured materiality, the divine humanity or Sophia. In Dionysius' cosmology, matter plays a less prominent role, although material symbols also mediate divine presence. So Dionysian mysticism and Sophiology operate with different paradigms of religious experience. For Dionysius, the highest form of religious experience is an affable union which dangerously verges on absorption into the divine. In Sophianic mysticism, the images of divine beauty are not superseded by utterly imageless and ineffable experience of God. And so, unlike Lossky and Meyendorff, Bulgakov and Berdyaev are not concerned with offering a master narrative of Eastern Orthodox theology, purified of Western influences. Bulgakov, as we might recall, sees Dionysius as a signpost on the trajectory leading from Plato to Kant. Thus, the scope of Bulgakov's and Berdyaev's interests is broader and less conditioned by the rigid dichotomy between the theologically orthodox East and the heterodox West. Both of them are prepared to admit that mystical theology and doctrinal orthodoxy were sometimes at odds with each other. In fact, for Berdyaev, this was a crucial tension between the spiritual freedom of the mystics and the institutional constraints of church authorities. In contrast to Berdyaev, Meyendorff claims that, I quote, Byzantium never knew any conflict, not even a polarization between theology and what the West calls mysticism, unquote. In other words, Meyendorff takes Lossky's normative claim about the ideal relationship between mysticism and dogmatic theology and turns it now into a descriptive generalization about the historical development of Byzantine theology. Now, Orthodox scholars should resist projecting their theological ideals or simply favorite theological views upon the Church's past. Sound apologetics should also be sound historical theology, if we are interested in truth as opposed to self-aggrandizement, especially when it comes to constructing an identity that is predicated on rejecting the West. Lossky and Yannaras are deeply invested in de-Westernizing Dionysius and presenting his theology as an authentic form of Christian Hellenism. This apologetic preoccupation makes these scholars turn a blind eye to the problematic features of Dionysian theology highlighted by Meyendorff and Veschi. Their preoccupation also leads to a one-sided understanding of Dionysius. The fullness of his vision was somehow grasped in the East, but misunderstood in the West. But unlike Lossky and his Orthodox followers, Dionysius did not write the mystical theology of the Eastern Church, or even the mystical theology of the Western Church. He wrote mystical theology tout court, because for him, the enterprise of theologizing was not about identity labels or self-differentiation from one's theological opponents. Rather, it was about seeking truth and about communion with God. As Dionysius writes in his 7th letter, as far as I'm concerned, I've never spoken out against the Greeks or any others. In my view, good men are satisfied to know and to proclaim as well as they can the truth itself as it really is. Thus, Dionysius' theology refuses any domestication as something peculiarly Eastern or peculiarly Western, as something exemplifying proper Christian mysticism or something compromised by late antique forms of pagan Platonism. As Orthodox theologians continue to engage Dionysius today, and I certainly hope we do, perhaps we could become more attuned to Dionysius' own expressed desire to know and to proclaim, as well as we can, the truth as it really is. Thank you very much.
Paul, thank you for that very wonderful presentation. Would you like to take some questions, a few questions?
We have a couple of minutes here, perhaps.
Einstein gave a lecture at Princeton, and after the lecture, he asked that question, and he said the silence means either total comprehension or total incomprehension.
I usually actually give an image of Einstein in a photo that says "question everything." I don't think I have one right now.
I'm curious, you mentioned Bulgakov and then Russian Sophianism. If you could just, maybe this is way too big a question, but can you give a quick comparison of Dionysius' treatment of wisdom, which he does, and really the divine name, and the very unique Russian development of divine Sophia? Is there any relation between those? Are they expressing a Dionysian concept, or is it totally foreign?
No, I mean, it seems to me, I suppose the interesting parallel would be the fact that there is a certain refusal to utterly and completely Christologize the image of wisdom. So in that regard, there is an interesting parallel. But I also would say that it's parallel in many ways in name only. So my principal point was to suggest that in the panentheistic scheme of Russian sociologists, you have humanity as an eternal attribute of the life of God. You certainly do not find, in a kind of a very heightened sense of divine transcendence, in Dionysian mysticism a similar trope. He simply does not venture the speculation of precisely what happens to Christ's human nature eschatologically. He simply doesn't develop that particular position. And I think in that regard, Lossky is certainly much closer in sort of thinking in a Dionysian manner. But that is not to suggest, therefore, that so the trap into which Lossky, I suppose, falls in this regard is that of almost an ontological wall between the immanent life of God and the economic expressions. Whereas in sociology, there is an opposite, if you will, problem. But returning, again, I mean, it is very interesting to look at the extent to which Russian sociologists and Dionysius are biblical and what precisely are the materials that are drawing on. And of course, in Russian sociology, it's a much more extensive treatment of the matter that captures not only the scriptural material on the subject. And I think they're fundamentally right that on the one hand, you want to maintain a Christological focus, but on the other hand, you also want to expand the notion of Sophia such that it is broader than simply association with the second person of the Trinity. So I think that's how I see parallels. Does that help?
We've got time for one more. Paul?
It's interesting how origin is always sort of a straw man in the back of the room in these kinds of constructions. And I wonder how much contemporary Orthodox treatments of Dionysius are going to be changed by some of the newer scholarship on origin.
I think they will be changed profoundly. I mean, this was simply not a part. I think they would be changed dramatically. So, for example, we have, I mean, from John Baer, he's going to, I mean, there's a kind of already a mystical tradition associated with the publication of that volume, but the volume itself is not out. But I sort of, yeah. But what I wanted to indicate is actually Meyendorff, in some ways, constructively leads us in some interesting direction here. So for Lossky, essentially, bad Platonism in origin, entirely kosher Platonism in Dionysius. That is the way in which he conceives of these things. Florovsky is rather interesting in this regard. He pays kind of a deferential respect to Dionysius, eloques him in his patrology, and then doesn't touch him. He doesn't actually touch mystical tradition in general. He wanted to write a volume on Simeon and Palamas, wrote to his wife about the matter, but he never did. And it's rather interesting that there's a kind of a silence about Dionysius, broadly speaking, in Florovsky. And Florovsky was certainly not a fan of a hyper-duper apophaticism that kind of eviscerates the cataphatic. Okay, but Florovsky himself was kind of an adamant opponent of origin. So anti-originism is something that he kind of predicates neo-patristic synthesis on. And I think whenever you read anti-originism, you also have to think about Bulgakov himself. So in many ways, it's fighting Bulgakov. So I think that the judgment is going to be changed on this. But I also think that there is certainly quite a profound difference between the manner of speculation that one finds in Origen and Denis. And therefore, again, Dionysius as a closet or crypto-originist, that view of Pelican itself requires, a considerable rethinking and possibly even rejection. I think we have a kind of a...
Thank you for your presentation. Was it familiar with the scholars, Eric Fleur?
Eric Pearl, yes. And there we go. Mm-hmm.
So when you put this up there, kind of straightforward question, are you putting this up there as something that you agree with or disagree with? Because at the end of your presentation, I feel like you were pushing
Well, yes, I'm pushing back against Eric Pearl because one should be aware of the fact that lots of things that he's talking about here are, for example, available to Western Christians in Bonaventuran appropriation of Dionysian tradition. It's simply unfair to say many of the things that he's saying here. But I didn't want to overload my material with undue criticism of that position. At the same time, it's a very elegant apologetic exposition by one of the best, known Christian Platonists of our time. So there you go. Yeah.
A very well-known Orthodox theologian is known to keep coming out with "we of the East," and I keep saying, "What do you mean, East End of London?" Or thank you for that very fine presentation, and brings to an end our conference. And before I invite Father Daniel to do our final doxology and prayer, I just want to say a very quick thank you to all of you for coming out on a day, a winter's evening in 38 degrees Fahrenheit, as the darkness comes around us, as the world turns away from the sun again. But special thanks to Nia Sumakis, who is sponsoring tonight's reception. And although it is the 9th of December, it's really liturgically the feast of St. Nicholas of Myra, because we tried to get the conference on his day, so it's Santa Claus night. And we're having, albeit the winter fast, we're having a wine and reception in the room straight opposite. So please stay for a while and have a glass of wine and talk. Just go across the lobby, straight across into the other room in 5 minutes. And thanks to Nia for sponsoring tonight's reception, as well as for her role, and with Matt Pereira, I've worked so hard on the executive committee of Sophia. Thank you for those things. And thanks also for the crew of very faithful, energetic helpers with all of these really annoying details that make a conference like this go so smoothly. Nobody, it just works wonderfully. Marilyn Sinkovich and Jess Gilbert, who've, with Karen and Pia Chowdhury, have done all of the catering arrangements all day. And Kevin McGee, who's helped set up the refectory with Nia tonight. Many thanks to the registrars, Judith Scott, who's done this for 10 years, and Julia, who's assisted her today. Recurring thanks to our patrons, Bill and Maria Spears, who came this morning. They always come, and then I always offer them lunch, and then they rush off. I think they're going to somewhere infinitely better than our. And Helmar Nielsen, who wanted to be here, always wants to be here, and was ill, so he can't come. So if you remember him in your prayers for his speedy recovery. And lastly, thanks to Priyatasa Eileen for all the many things she has to put up with, and for keeping the Sophia accounts straight. Pay no attention to that woman behind the curtain. Atsede Alegba, who gave the first talk in this room this afternoon on Ethiopian liturgy, is the winner of this year's Holodny Prize, which Dr. Holodny has offered a little fund to mark people in the book, Orthodoxy and Sacred Arts, whose essay stands out, who aren't already professors. So she won that one, and she got it, and she ran. So I shouldn't have given her a approach. She has to go for the Ethiopian feast of the presentation of the Virgin in the temple. So tonight, so somebody's on the wrong calendar. And so again, thanks to everybody who's come. I look forward to all of these things stewing, and it has the potential for a great book, doesn't it? We don't know the title of next year's, but we're working on that, and keep in touch with us. If you haven't had an email from us, you might not be on the email list, so email us and we'll make sure you are for the future. Father Daniel? Okay.